Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum, which is dedicated to serious thinking for a serious church. And this is a project from the London Lyceum. Now, before we get started into the episode today, remember to go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that already. So if you're watching YouTube on your computer, you're watching it on your phone, find that subscribe button and click it for me. And if you can, also hit the little like button. And if you like it or don't like it, drop a comment. I'd love to hear your feedback. I enjoy that sort of aspect of YouTube. It's a lot of fun. Now, for this particular topic, I'm going to be talking, or not this particular topic, this particular episode, I'm going to be talking about multi-site churches and multi-service churches. So I've written an essay several years ago, it's with Theologica, on whether multi-site churches are legit or not, if they're true churches, and how that all works out. I've also written a short little essay on the London Lyceum. Right when we first launched our website, I tried to distill one of the main arguments of that essay into a short 1,000-word essay, put that there. So I'm going to put both of those in the show notes so that you can check them out. Because I think multi-site churches, multi-service churches are pretty widely known now, widely experienced. Pretty much every major, if the city has more than 25,000 people, I feel like there's at least one multi-site church. It seems like multi-service churches are pretty much, it seems like, ubiquitous to me. No matter what church you go to, it's very rare anymore to find a church that only has one service. It's almost like it's a church plant or it's a dying church for some reason. They only have one service. It seems like everywhere you go, they have that. And what I found is that at some point, I don't know, when it was in college, I was introduced to 9 Marks of a Healthy Church by Mark Dever, and introduced that whole world. And in that world, there's very much a one service, one location. Otherwise, it's not really a church. And I breathed that in, and I agreed with that. And so I came to this point, I was like, I want to defend this, because I look everywhere, and it seems like if people look at that and they think that's archaic, that's old, that's outdated, that's really non-practical, impragmatic. I mean, I've interned at multi-site churches. I've been members at multi-site churches, big ones. And it seems like there's just this uncritical, this is a theological good because we can share the gospel with more people. So why wouldn't we do that? And to me, it's pretty interesting that Brad House and Greg Allison, who have written a book called Multi-Church. I want to quote from them here because I think this is a fascinating aspect of just when we're thinking about multi-site and multi-service churches. They say, practically speaking, we had a few options. Turning people away who wanted to hear the gospel was simply not an option. This move to a multi-site expression was driven pragmatically by a need for space, and little thought was given to the trajectory on which this set the church. This pattern of growth is typical for most churches as they stumble into multi-site. That's interesting to me, because it truly admits that this isn't a theological sort of movement. This is truly a pragmatic decision based upon, we've got a bunch of people at our church and we don't have space for them. What do? We don't have the money to build a bigger sanctuary or build a bigger church. So maybe what we can do is add another service where we have now a service at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock instead of just 10 a.m. And that way, now we're a multi-service church. We have 2 distinct temporal locations for worship. People come at 9, people come at 11. It's the same everything, same preacher, same songs, same offering. Everything's the same except the time of the service. And then you have the other churches who say, look, we have a bunch of people who are coming in 45 minutes away from town C over here, and we want to create another location for them to be able to part of this church because they don't like the churches around them. They love the church that we have, but they don't want to drive so far. So let's go ahead and just clone our church and put it there. And you've got a couple of options in this sort of like multi-site stuff. I remember when it first became bigger, multi-site seemed to be more based on like you pump in some video and you watch a video of the sermon. You have a live band sometimes, but you've got video preaching, and you've got like maybe a campus pastor there that will pray and stand up and do announcements and that kind of thing. And I think it's since shifted a little bit to where you might have live preaching from your campus pastor, but you're fundamentally under this like one institution, whether, it's the same name of the church, it's the same budget of the church, and there's like some sort of shared leadership structure. where you're all kind of put together. Now, as I say in that essay, that I think that's when you do that, you're fundamentally creating an Episcopal church government. So I should mention, I'm coming at this from a Protestant perspective. I'm coming at this from a Baptistic perspective as well. So I'm not necessarily making arguments that when I talk about it's potentially problematic that you're creating your own hierarchical Episcopal sort of government. Some people might say, well, I don't have a problem with that because I'm an Anglican or whatever, and that's cool. That's fine. As a Baptist, though, that might create some issues and tensions for your own polity, that if you think that is theologically derived from the text of Scripture, that the church should be a local congregation that is distinct and does not have sort of like a required leadership submission structure to other external churches, you might find that as problematic. So, I've been talking a lot. Multi-site churches, they exist. I think I've given some definitions. They have different temporal spaces for worship, multi-service. They have different geographical spaces for worship. That would be sort of like the multi-church, or I guess the multi-site model. And really, these are questions and realities that simply did not exist until the last, I don't know, probably 100 years or something, when the car became a thing and people could actually travel more than a mile away to get to church. That radically shifts and changes things. And now that we have all these technological advances, we have come to a situation where there's actually a critical mass where our sanctuary can hold 200 people, but we actually have more than 200 people coming. It's never really been a massive problem on a large scale, because churches just simply didn't have enough people to even come up with such an issue. So what I did in this original essay, and I still stand by, I think, most of it, and you'll find out, at least for me, when I write essays, part of what I'm doing is trying to think through how I understand ideas, and writing it is a great form of knowing for me. And I find also that as years go by, I realize I disagree with stuff that I've written in the past. But I think for the most part, in this one, I'm cool with this. So I had like a 4-pronged approach to say why I think multi-site and multi-service churches are. What I say is, it's not that they're not a church. They are a church, but they are a separate, distinct, numerically distinct church. So even if you have the same name, say it's First Baptist, whatever, or First Presbyterian, whatever, if you institute a second service, I argued in this essay that you are creating a numerically distinct church. Metaphysically speaking, you are required for that to be a second church. So whatever you call it, it's actually another church. In the same sense, multi-site, which I think is a little bit easier to swallow and understand, I said that's a distinct, separate church. Although I do argue pretty strongly that any online iteration, online only, that is not a church. So in this first principle that I tried to engage was the marks of the church. So traditionally in Protestant Reformed thought, there are 3 marks of the church, or 1 mark of the church. 3 marks: rightly preaching the word, rightly administering sacraments, rightly administering discipline. Some want to just say, well, it's all packaged up in the preaching of the word, which is fine, whatever. But I take the 3 just for clarity's sake in the essay, and I try to work through, can you truly preach the word? Can you truly administer the sacraments? And can you truly exercise discipline on a multi-service model or on a multi-site model? And if you can't, then that seems to suggest that you are either potentially not a church, or you are potentially deficient in some way. Maybe you're an ontologically distinct church. So think, for example, rightly practicing discipline. If you have an online congregation only, I don't see any way that you can actually practice discipline. If you want to administer the sacraments, how are you to baptize an online member? How are you to give the table to an online member? Now you're going to say, well, some people might say, well, there's the metaverse or whatever. No, I say, and I suggest in this essay, that if you look at the text of Scripture and if you make the theological sort of connections from the text of Scripture, you're going to realize that what is entailed in the Eucharist, what is entailed in baptism. I specifically focus on communion or the Eucharist or the Lord's table in this essay because I think it is extremely relevant to realize that this is not just a meal. In some sense, it's required to be spatio-temporally coextensive. So you look at various texts in Scripture where Paul is commanding the Corinthians to wait for one another, assuming that you must all be together when you partake of this meal. You can't take it 2 hours early. With these other people coming later, there's something necessary in that meal that everyone takes it together so they can display their unity and so that they can experience the unity that is supposed to be given from a specific local congregation. And so I suggest that if you can't do that, you are creating problems for traditional polity or ecclesiology. And I do this with some other stuff, and I try to work through some different problems. Go read the essay if you want to read more in detail on some of those things. I'm trying to give you the overall experience here. The thing that I want to focus on, though, is the second sort of principle assessing multi-site. I talk about group theory in this, and I've got a book that I recommend if you're not familiar with group theory and you want to get familiar with group theory. There's this real easy, it's 140 pages on groups as agents, and I'll link to this in the description as well. I think this is a really nice introduction to the topic because what I try to do here is to build out something that John Webster has done in his own ecclesiology, calling the church as sort of like a social group. What does he say? I know, let me look in this essay to get it right. So I've got it here. The church is a social space. That's what he calls it. And so in building out this idea of social space, there are particular sort of like intentional states that local churches must embody. Things like forming beliefs, things like having actions and greeting one another and hearing the word and singing to one another that you must do to be part of this social space that is the church. And so I take this idea of group theory and say if the church is a social group, which I think it is, the Scripture I think assumes that it's a group, it's a particular sort of something that's above and beyond the individuals. So in group theory, there are really two senses of groups. There's the realist version of groups, and then there's a non-realist version of groups. A realist is going to say a group is a true and legitimate thing above and beyond the individuals, whereas a non-realist is going to look at the individuals of a group and say, look, it's just the individuals. Everything reduces down to the individuals. So if you look at a group like, I don't know, a football team, look at the Carolina Panthers. So the Carolina Panthers, you'd say that there's no actual entity called the Carolina Panthers above and beyond just who the individuals are. The general manager, the head coach, the football players that are there, it's all just individuals. You can't put any responsibility, put any agency in an actual group there. Now, a realist is going to say, no, there is something over and above that. And I argue that group theory, we should be realists about groups. Now, we shouldn't be realists about groups to where everything becomes a group. It's not like me and the books behind me are a group in any real sense. I would say that what is necessary for a group to exist is some sort of like novel causal power. So it's not just like me sitting in my back lawn and there's a lamppost to say, look, we're a group because we're close to each other. There's got to be something that unique that is produced when you're together. So the church is able to produce particular novel things that are impossible apart from the group itself. And so with this metaphysical framework in mind and this theological idea from John Webster that the church is a social space, I argue that if these things are true, there are certain intentional states that are required of the church to continue to exist this way, and that includes spatio-temporal coextensivity. Basically, I'm saying you got to be physically present with other people, or else you're not a church. or you're a numerically distinct local church. Now, I think this makes quite a bit of sense. It rules out multi-site pretty quickly. The question, though, is does multi-service get ruled out that quickly? And I used to be very strong on this, and as I've thought about it more, I've wondered if there are potential problems with the proposal I had in that essay. And it's because in that essay, I'm thinking you have to, if something creates a regularly distinct center of worship, even if it's 5 feet away in a different room, I say that's a different church. But what if there's significant cross-pollination? What if people are worshiping at the 9 o'clock service twice a week, and the other 2 times a week they're worshiping at the 11 a.m. service, to the point at which these people are all coming in contact with each other at least every other week and worshiping together as a single church at least every other week? And I'm less confident about my proposal given some of these further thoughts. So if you have ideas or thoughts, I'd love to hear them below in the comments. Drop a comment. Are multi-service churches distinct local churches where you have church A and church B actually functioning just in the same building? Or are they truly the same church and you can say, without question, this is the same church? Now, I get it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you'd want to have multi-service because that saves you a lot of money as a church, not having to build another building. And it's convenient, especially if you have kids. You don't want to go to 11 a.m. service if they're supposed to nap at noon or whatever. Like, I get it. So if there's theological reasons to say they are the same church, I can understand the pressure. But you don't want those pragmatic issues, in my opinion, to put undue influence on our own theological construction. Pragmatic stuff matters. It plays a role in theological construction, but should not be the dominating piece. So really what I try to do in this essay is, and I go through several texts of Scripture as well, Galatians and Philippians, showing these ideas of there's supposed to be this real physical presence. And I give some examples of what it means to be a local church, where let's say you're a missionary in another country and you attend faithfully another local church 1,000 miles away via video. You watch all the same sermons, you pray the same prayers, but you're never physically there. There is something that's missing, without a doubt. And that physical presence, that ability to act and know, there's this presence requires at least knowledge of what's going on and in the ability to act in all the ways that are going on there. And if you can't do those things, you're not fulfilling the idea that I think is required of presence, that is just assumed throughout Scripture for what it means to be a member of a local church and to be a single local church. Now, I also worked out a couple of other ideas in this essay about multi-site churches. I talked about the denominational principle, which I think I already mentioned a little bit, where I think if you have sort of a Baptistic, Congregationalist ecclesiology and polity, multi-site churches definitely do not make sense. If you want to accept an episcopal sort of structured government, this has no bite whatsoever. So if you want to go with that, this idea of multi-site doesn't make sense. In my opinion, though, if you want to be a Baptist or a Congregationalist in any sense, you can't have multi-site churches because you are fundamentally giving up your own ecclesiological principles. I don't see any way around that. What was the other idea that I had in this essay? So I talked about the denominational principles. I'm looking through it now. Oh, the regulative principle. So I also think it is important that you don't see any examples in Scripture of multi-site or multi-service churches, as far as I'm aware. I know Greg Allison tries to give an example. I don't find that convincing in any way. I love Greg. I think he's awesome. He's very sharp. I don't agree with him on this point. So if you take the regulative principle as a true, fair idea regarding worship, then you don't want to add in what Scripture doesn't contain, and Scripture doesn't seem to contain any multi-site or multi-service churches. Therefore, we don't want to go down that road. So that's really what I'm doing here. And I do think fundamentally that single service churches and single site churches produce greater virtue than alternative models. I also think, because really, I had a mentor back in college, and we were talking about the idea of multi-site, multi-service churches, and he really pressed this home to me, and I think he's right. When you get to a certain number of growth where you don't have the space or you don't have the capacity for some reason to stay at a single service or a single site, you decide, I need to create a multi-site. He asked, why are you creating a multi-site service or a multi-site church when you could plant a church somewhere else? And he boiled it down to, it's like money and ego end up being the driving forces for like multi-site churches. He didn't seem to be, so he didn't talk about multi-service churches there. And I'm conflicted about what I think about multi-service churches. Some days I think, yeah, it's fine. Some days I don't. I still think single service is the ideal, no matter what, just because you actually are able to worship together with the same people every Sunday, no matter what. But I'm not convinced that is necessarily wrong to do it otherwise, and there could be other theological goods that you get from that could potentially in some way compensate for it. But I think fundamentally, there is a sense in which the multi-site service model, when it's pretended to be like church of let's just fellowship church. Well, that's a really generic name. Fellowship church starts 10 churches around them. They all pump video in or whatever. They have their own campus pastors. Why not release them to be their own local congregations? Well, our money can serve them better. Well, why not just give them money and not have any strings attached? Let them be their own local church. Or, well, we have, I don't know, greater resources and we don't have control over it. Well, that seems like an issue of control and not necessarily an issue of the proclamation of the gospel and those other goods that have been mentioned. So I just don't see any reason to not let go and plant other churches. Now, if you think there are reasons to have multi-site churches, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below, tell me what you think. Now, this has been my own thoughts here for the last, I don't know how long I've been talking, 20 minutes or whatever, on multi-site, multi-service churches. I am definitely not convinced of multi-site churches. I think it's bad for a lot of reasons. And it does seem that the influence of multi-site churches has waned over the years because I think people have realized this just isn't fundamentally what a church should be. You're missing something. You're almost creating prepackaged, entertainment bundles or something. Whereas multi-service churches don't seem to have the same sense of this is problematic in the same ways. Depending on how you should think about the metaphysics of the church, what makes a church, that could impinge on it, which is what I've been trying to think through. Another book I should mention, I guess, is Jonathan Leeman's One Assembly. I think his is the most expansive treatment on this subject in defense of a single service and single site. I think you should go visit it. What I did in this essay was try to build out that group theory idea, which I don't think anyone else has done. You don't find it anywhere. And remember, this essay that I'm posting here will be open access, so anybody can read it for free, which is awesome. So yeah, that's it. Give me comments. Let me know what you think. Yes, good, yes. You say yes, multi-site, multi-service churches. You say no multi-site, no multi-site service. Are you in between somewhere? What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to see what you guys come with, if you disagree with me or not. Anyway, enjoyed talking. And yeah, I missed last week on creating an episode. I was going to do this one, but I was slammed with work and very, very tired and just decided, you know what, I'm going to take a week off. I'm probably going to do that periodically. I'm going to try to do weekly, but there's going to be weeks where I just say, you know what, I'm not doing an episode this week. And hopefully that just whets your appetite more than anything, so you come back and you listen to or watch some more of these. And yeah, okay, I'm done talking. I'll talk to you guys soon. This has been Kiffin's Keep, and it's been fun to think together.